Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be diving back into the seemingly endless well of bizarre German World War II experimental aircraft. A very deep well, rich with all manner of off-the-wall and innovative concepts. From flying wing jet bombers not too dissimilar from something like the B-2 Spirit bomber, to clunky-looking emergency aircraft that were designed for the average German citizen to hop right in and throw themselves into the meat grinder that is war. The company we'll be looking at today is one that we've visited many a times, as they are rather infamous for their bizarre design concepts, and that is none other than Blohm and Voss. To date, we've looked at things that look like Star Wars pod racers, a W-wing bomber, an oblique-wing jet fighter, a really asymmetric flying boat, and a wingtip cockpit plane. All very strange. The one that I've decided to take a look at today, though, very well might be my favorite, though, simply because I think it looks like something that an edgy middle schooler would draw in their notebook to make a really cool-looking plane. This is a plane that kind of looks like it's wearing a necklace. This is the Blohm Voss P-192. This wonderful monstrosity appears to have been born from the increasing obsolescence of German ground attack aircraft from around mid-war on. In the early stages of World War II, Germany could comfortably rely on fast bombers like the Dornier Do-17 and dive bombers like the Junkers Ju-87, while the Do-17 would effectively be pulled from frontline use due to inherent limits on its destructive potential. It being a smaller, lighter bomber, the Ju-87 would largely be an effective plane for most of the war, though. Despite being painfully slow, the Ju-87 excelled in it being a dive bomber due to it being able to dive just about vertically, along with having a system that allowed the plane to pull out from the dive automatically. Typically, dive bombers don't perform dives like the Stuka did because the G-forces that were experienced on the dive and the pull-out from the dive would be incredibly severe, enough to cause vision impairments and the pilots being rendered unconscious. But with the automatic system in place, pilots didn't really have to worry about pulling out of the dive themselves, and instead they could focus their efforts on just staying conscious. Still, even as effective as the Stuka was, because of its poor speed and poor combat ability when not in a dive, as Germany began to lose air superiority in the latter half of the war, planes like the Stuka became increasingly vulnerable to enemy fighters. Additionally, as Russian forces would make advances in the east, Allied forces would attack to the south via Sicily and Italy, and the threat of an additional Allied invasion to the north was ever present. Not only would Germany potentially need some upgraded dive bombers, they would also likely need some upgraded ground attackers. Low-level attack planes with large caliber guns that could strafe enemy troop positions, enemy armor, enemy artillery, etc. While the Ju-87 did have variants that turned them into tank destroyers and general ground attackers and the like, their general poor performance and their top speed often did still hamper them, despite them performing pretty well in these roles. This would lead to a plethora of proposed late-war dive bombers and ground attackers that would ideally be replacing the Stuka, providing some high-performance ground support. To this need for such a plane, Blohm and Voss would present an incredibly bizarre design in the P-192. Ignoring the location of the propeller for now, the general design of the 192 was both very odd and relatively practical. Measuring in at 11.8 meters long, 13.2 meters wide, and 4.3 meters tall, the 192 would have a low-set wing around the middle of the fuselage, with a straight leading edge and a strong taper on the trailing edge that gave it a quasi-forward-swept appearance. The tail was a pretty standard sort of T-tail design that had the horizontal stabilizers halfway up the vertical stabilizer, the cockpit with a bubble-style canopy was at the very front of the fuselage, which would give the pilot excellent forward vision, which was very much excellent for a dive bomber and ground attacker. Extending out from each side of the cockpit would be a pair of smaller wings/support structures/canards, whatever you want to call them. These smaller sections would attach to the wing-mounted guns. While I do not know 100% what the reason for this design choice was, it does still look pretty cool, so it does have that going for it. And speaking of the guns, the armament would consist of 4 forward-firing guns, perhaps 5 if they'd so desired. The normal outfit had 2 20mm MG-151 machine guns in the nose, and 2 30mm Mk-108 cannons in the wings. Optionally, a 50mm Mk-114 cannon could be fit somewhere on this design. Underneath the fuselage would likely be 500 kilograms of explosives, and they would also likely be able to fit some bombs under wing as well should they so desire. Now for the very clear oddity in this design, the engine and the propeller. Powering the P-192 would either be a Daimler-Benz DB603 or a Junkers Umo 213, each with a roughly around 2,000 horsepower. The DB603 would be the designated engine for the initial 192 design, the 192-01, and the Umo 213 would be for a very slightly different second design, the 192-02. That design would feature a very slightly reduced wingspan and a slightly altered tail surface. For all intents and purposes, though, the two designs were basically the same. In order to give the pilot excellent forward vision unobstructed by the propeller, Blohm Voss elected to forego putting the propeller on the tail as a pure pusher plane, and instead placed it just behind the cockpit, with the propeller seemingly extending out from a small gap in the fuselage. The engine would be buried in the fuselage just behind the propeller. For cooling purposes, on the leading edge of the wings near the root would be 2 open slits that would feed into radiators. Now, going back to those smaller forward wing/support things, while again I'm not 100% sure what they were for, some unsourced things that I read said they were for some structural or aerodynamic reason, which does make sense to me given that the propeller being where it was would mean that there was less support between the cockpit and the rest of the fuselage. Given Blohm Voss's propensity for odd, unconventional designs, though, I do have a different idea. Their relative size does seem to match up with the size of dive brakes or flaps on more conventional aircraft, so some part of me does wonder if they were trying to do something a bit out there and have the dive brakes be forward. Or perhaps, if not some form of dive brake, maybe they could have acted as additional flaps that could help pull the nose up to get out of a dive more efficiently. Either way, I feel like those forward sections would have had some greater role than support. That is just my speculation, though, so don't take that as fact. Regardless of the intention of those smaller structures, though, Blohm Voss would never get the opportunity to test out this very bizarre design, as it was swiftly rejected due to its oddness, with such a propeller placement just being too much of an unknown. The 192 design would end just as quickly as it started, but Blohm Voss seemingly took the message that such a design was too unconventional to heart, and came back with another design in the 193, another unconventional design that was at least a bit more conventional than the 192, and the 193 appears to be a direct derivative of the 192, as the cockpit and wing design were basically identical. What made it different was the propeller location, the tail configuration, and general size. The length and width of the 193 was about 1.5 meters less than the 192. Why they would reduce the size like that, I am unsure, but I would speculate that it was to reduce weight and improve aerodynamic performance. while the engine would remain in the same spot around the midpoint of the fuselage. The propeller was relocated from just behind the cockpit to the very end of the tail, now making it a pure pusher plane. While pusher props were still relatively unconventional, they were far and away more conventional than the mid-body prop of the 192. The drive shaft would extend down the length of the tail and connect to the tail propeller, and no doubt this would end up raising durability concerns down the line. Additionally, as the propeller was on the tail now, the tail surfaces were altered in an effort to protect this propeller. A normal tail design was rotated 180 degrees, so the vertical stabilizer pointed down instead of up. The stabilizer was just tall enough to extend past the propeller. This meant that if there was a rough landing, the stabilizer would hit the ground and not the propeller. I think a pretty ingenious little design change. And for this new design, Blohm Voss would actually provide some estimated performance stats. They would predict that with a UMO 213 engine, the top speed at sea level would be 298 miles an hour, and at 23,000 feet, the top speed would be 354 miles an hour. Now, being that it was a ground attacker and dive bomber, it probably would never be at 23,000 feet, so it's not as if that statistic actually mattered all that much, but regardless, the gun armament would also likely be similar to the 192, but the bomb armament was projected to be greater at 1,000 kilos. And yet, despite the 193 being far more practical than the 192, it too was swiftly rejected by the German military. And while both of these designs would have better specs than the Stuka, at least hypothetically, it does make complete sense why they were rejected. First and foremost, what Germany needed later in the war was fighters that could re-establish air superiority. If they had air superiority, then the Stuka would certainly be sufficient enough as a dive bomber and ground attacker. And in fact, in the limited cases where Germany achieved air superiority late in the war, this proved true. It was an outdated plane now, to be sure, but there were bigger fish to fry, more pressing needs in the German military. So personally, while I would have loved for these two planes to be accepted and become real-life prototypes out of sheer curiosity, Germany did make the right call and ruined all of our fun. How rude of them. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. You know, it's warming up now, and right now there's a tiny gnat across my computer screen as I'm reading this, and I hate it. I'm honestly much more of a cold weather kind of guy. You can keep stacking on layers, but you can only take off so many layers before you're just down to your skin. Also, in all honesty, I do type these little end sections out, and that is absolutely not what I wrote, but there was a fly across my screen and I got distracted. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.